So as many of you know, I wasn't born in this country. I came here as an immigrant in the year 2000, and I had a ham radio license before, and I actually got a ham license here. So I was licensed in Trinidad and Tobago for the first 3 years or so of my ham radio career, and then I got licensed in the United States on June 15th, 2001. And therefore, that means that June 15th, 2021 made it 20 years, which I got an amateur radio license in the US. But this year, 2022, makes it 21 years. 21 years seems to be kind of significant for some people because it's the age in the United States at which you can have a drink, an adult drink, as I tell my kids. And they want to make it so that you can buy a Second Amendment item at 21. It's also recognized as the age of majority for a lot of people, even though you can vote at 18, you can join the military at 18, and you can pretty much do a lot of things at 18. So, and you know, in most countries, 18 years is the date of adulthood, period. Even though some countries try to tell you not 21, but 25 is when you can do things. So today we're going to talk about things that have happened in between now and then, because I feel it's a good point to look back and see some of the things that changed and my personal perspectives. So number one, my focus in amateur radio. My focus in amateur radio wasn't always HF contesting, DXing, etc. I was very big into emergency communications and public service events. Quite frankly, because that was what was sold to me. A lot of people marketed amateur radio to me as a public service. Famously, N2NOV, he ran this group called New York City, well, it used to be New York City Aries, and then eventually when they had their disagreement with the ARRL, they formed a little group called New York City AREX, Amateur Radio Emergency Communications Service. It's kind of like a breakaway group that does their own thing and has their own relationships with served agencies. I kind of got away from the MCOM thing for a few reasons, and I'll tell you some of these reasons. One of them was I discovered DXing and contesting, and two, I moved away from the city and into the suburbs, and it wasn't really something that triggered that, but it had to do with my whole adventures in amateur radio and the organizations that I joined and got into. So the next thing is number two, I got into contesting and DXing. And this was at the motivation of a few people. Number one, Steve Mendelson, W2ML, who I actually met him through my work in public service with the New York City Marathon. And then he asked me when I moved to New Jersey because of job stuff, he asked me if I wanted to join the North Jersey DX Association, which I did. And one of the requirements for NJDXA membership was that you had to have a DXCC membership. So I did not have a DXCC at that time, a DXCC award, and you had to have a count of 100 countries or entities worked. So I actually did that, and within a year I got my DXCC, and then I joined NJDXA. But then talking to other DXers, particular Peter W2IRT and a few others, I began to gather this interest in DXing, not only from a personal achievement standpoint, but also competitive with other DXers, wanting to get to their level or maybe even exceed their level just because I could. So I discovered the DXCC Challenge, I discovered the 5-band DXCC awards, and then I actually got more into DXing. Then I got recruited into Frankfurt Radio Club because as a DXer, you then go into contesting because contesting is where a lot of DX is. So I got into the Frankfurt Radio Club. I was actually recruited by Glenn K3 Papa, and he basically asked, he saw my score posted on one of the contest message boards, and he was like, hey, you make a lot of good score. How about you join FRC and contribute your points? I'm like, really? You can do that? So I ended up becoming a contester. and I began to get seriously into contesting. And I've scored millions of points in contesting, and I actually won a couple times the United States and came second a couple other times. And I basically have gotten a lifelong interest in contesting. So I got into DXing and contesting. Another thing I did was I began to take leadership roles in organizations. So eventually, when you get into ham radio and people begin to notice you, you begin to get recruited for leadership in amateur radio organizations. Now, this is something that you don't have to do, but if you have the ability to make a difference, I would suggest that you go ahead and help out, but also consider an end date for when you plan to end your leadership role, because if you don't, it could go on into perpetuity. In my case, I started with a job as secretary of the NJDXA, and I actually helped them organize a lot of their minutes and record keeping and such like that. And then that kind of led to other things. I also I dropped out of that when I had kids and such like that, so life took over. But after that, I kind of almost accidentally fell into the director role at ARRL, which I have now. And, it's been good so far, and it's been really good to make a difference. Then, people see you for your activities on basically everything. Like, I began to help people with their radios and such like that, and Flex Radio, and then Flex began to notice that, and Flex kind of honored me with a couple of awards. So this brings me to the absolute next thing. I do not use the same radios I used to. The same radios I used to use. I had, in the beginning, I bought 2 radios. One of them was a Yaesu VX5 handheld radio, and the other one was an ICOM 746. Then later on, I tried to use that in an apartment, right? And the handheld, admittedly, was a lot more useful because I could go outside with that and operate. From the apartment, I had to dodge the super. I had to throw a wire out the window and try to operate with that. It was very frustrating. 100 watts into a little wire that you couldn't really get too far. I could make some contacts in CW, but a single sideband, forget it. And that time I didn't really know much about propagation. This was like in 2001, 2002. So those radios, I had those radios. Then I eventually got an ICOM 7000, which I installed in my car when I had already moved to New Jersey. And that was actually pretty good. That was a really, really good adventure to get in a car and be able to drive to places where you can get a good signal out. So that's what I did. The other thing is that at that point, I was actually working on my DXCC and contesting. The other thing is we began to look for real estate, ham-friendly real estate, and that's how I ended up with the house and a tower and beam and such like that. So one thing leads to another. Modes that I use, that's another thing. So using different modes, I used to use single sideband and CW almost exclusively, and somewhere around 2004, 2005, I began to delve into digital modes, PSK31 in the beginning. And then, of course, in 2016, 2015, 2016, I began to get into JT65, and then 2017, FT8. So these modes were really foreign to me, but then when I noticed them on the bands and I began to figure out that they were useful to make contacts on, I really got interested in them, and it's been pretty good. I've actually operated with Joe Taylor a couple times, especially at the United Nations, and it's been really fun. So try something different is all I gotta say. Another thing that I have done differently is that I've kind of gotten into other side activities into amateur radio. Like I've experimented with APRS, I've gotten into more kit building. Even though early on in my ham life I began to do kit building, I actually got into it later on. And that kind of helped me out. And I met up with people like Joe Eisenberg, and they helped me out with kit building as well too. Here's the other thing, the social scene. This is another thing I did differently. The social scene in ham radio. I was kind of like an introvert. I never really got into groups of people. And then at some point, when I began to get into contesting and DXing, that became a whole different social experience. And with that, I ended up going to more and more ham conventions, and then you get yourself more well known, and then you meet more people and you get involved in various things. So that's something you got to do. As far as the landscape of amateur radio, let's go over that. So in the year 2000, like I said, I was an MCOM. We had a much higher, it was pretty much at the peak of the solar cycle, so-called solar cycle 23 it might have been. And then cycle 23, we had a lot of DX going on, but I was oblivious to most of that because I was squarely in the VHF, UHF repeater world. And then, of course, that itself began to dwindle down as more people got onto cell phones. Today, it's kind of like there are some repeaters, but a lot of them are either change hands, they're shut down, or they're inactive. So a lot of hams are really not on the repeaters much anymore, but you find that they get on digital modes like DMR and such like that. And you can do DMR from either the repeaters or a hotspot or something like that. So that's one big change I noticed. The other thing is MCOM. I noticed like MCOM has been kind of different for a lot of people. It used to be really just radios, phone modes, you're talking on a mic and such like that. These days, a lot of served agencies are getting into digital modes. They're passing email, they're passing digital messages and such like that because it allows them to pass traffic verbatim. So this is a big change as well. In terms of contesting and DXing, well, I started out just tuning around and looking around, but later on I discovered how to use computer resources such as the DX cluster, and also how to use automated tools like reverse beacon network and such like that. And I began to study propagation a lot more and know when the bands are open. So that kind of helped me out a lot too. Another thing that has changed in the landscape of ham radio is that you find that there is a younger demographic. Even though ham radio itself is decidedly getting older, there is a younger enthusiastic demographic that kind of aids itself along via the internet. So you have people who, for example, like in the YouTubers bunch, we have a bunch of people who are, younger. A lot of us are younger, or young at heart. And a lot of us actually get into, mentoring people and, experimenting with different things. And we have our own scene, so to speak. So that kind of, that is a different thing that younger people get into. Other things I've noticed in ham radio, social media has really changed things. So not just where you get on and do DXing on a telnet cluster, but people get on Facebook, Twitter, and of course YouTube, Instagram, and such like that, and they publish their amateur radio activities. They say when DX is on, and all sorts of cool stuff with these social networks. So social networking has really changed all of that. A few other thing is that, organizations such as the ARRL, they're still important, but a lot of people are actually looking to do things independently, and I kind of understand that. At the same time, I do wish that the ARRL, and I am working toward where the ARRL actually helps with a more active role in getting people on the air, because I think that's definitely what we need to do. Some people say we could do without the ARRL. I disagree. I think that the ARRL is essential, and other national radio societies are essential to amateur radio's future. So we definitely need to push forward with that. What's for the next 25? Well, as I get older, I don't know. Maybe things will change. Maybe my amateur radio activities will change. Maybe one day I'll get bored with DXing and contesting. Maybe one day I'll get bored with ham radio. I don't think so. But I do know that I do plan to continue to mentor people into the future and to bring ham radio to you. And I think I'll stay on YouTube as long as YouTube is there. Again, my friends, Peace in 73.